Good morning.
Good morning. I shall never forget the first visit I paid to a hospital for mental defectives. These patients, I was told, all of them grown men, will never have more reasoning power than a child of 3 or 4. I was sitting at home one afternoon playing with a clockwork toy that my little boy had just been given when my wife came in and told me that Mr. and Mrs. Harris were waiting to see me in the surgery. It was to try to help the Harrises that I'd been to visit a mental deficiency hospital. I am a doctor, but mental deficiency is a little outside the general practitioner's line. My concern was for Mrs. Harris, who was, in my opinion, fast approaching a complete breakdown in health. Her boy, Johnny, was of course the reason. He was 19, his father told me, and obviously a severe case of arrested mental development. The strain of looking after him as if he was still a child was proving just too much for Mrs. Harris. The boy might have been admitted to hospital many years ago had Mr. Harris had his way. I was inclined to agree with him and suggested that the boy should enter a hospital now, if only for a while, to give Mrs. Harris a chance to recover her strength. But Mrs. Harris would have none of this. Johnny was her child. She loved the boy and would look after him herself, no matter what the cost. In the circumstances, there was little I could do to help her. I'm one of the lucky ones. Most of us are. Lucky to have been born sound in wind and limb, and mind. But for every 1,000, there are 12 born with some bodily handicap. The blind, the deaf, the lame. And there are some to whom nature has dealt even more cruel blow. 8 in every 1,000, born with some deficiency of mind. How thoughtless people are. Mental deficiency is a sheer misfortune. It can occur in any family. their children could have been the same. So could Timothy, for that matter. But we were among the fortunate ones. Our child, when he becomes a man, will put away childish things. These grown men at the hospital, however, will never be adult in mind. These particular patients are among the lowest grade, much more deficient in mind than Johnny Harris, and they're considered untrainable. Playing with these outsized toys has a definite therapeutic effect, I was told. Better by far than sitting idly around. I had promised to tell Mr. and Mrs. Harris what a mental deficiency hospital was like. That's why I was here. The medical superintendent and the matron showed me around. They showed me the schoolroom next. Many patients come here when quite young, and every effort is made to teach them to respond to music and commands. Some are higher in intelligence than others and learn to recognize words and their meanings. Others can be taught to paint. A few will learn to read and write. Many of the older patients are encouraged to keep their own wards in order, to make the beds and clean the floors. Some can be trained in simple mechanical movements, which can be put to use in the hospital laundry, or in repairing furniture and clothes, very useful in a hospital, of course, or making rugs and baskets. For the higher grade patients, there's always the hope of release, depending on their response to training and ability to mix. But returning to the outside world from the friendly atmosphere of the hospital is a much bigger step than many of them realize, or their relations. For this reason, most of the patients released go out at first on license, either to their own homes or to halfway hostels where they can live, still under the watchful eye of the hospital staff, while working at a variety of paid jobs in the neighborhood. The employer, like this farmer, finds them invariably punctual and hard-working, and not at all reluctant to take on those monotonous and sometimes unpleasant jobs that occur on every farm. His understanding treatment plays a great part in helping them back into the community. For those released on license to their own homes, local health authorities, particularly in the towns, can help with training centers, where the patients can learn a job in sheltered surroundings and build up confidence in themselves prior to complete discharge. The hospital and everything I saw there impressed me enormously, especially the care and devotion of the doctors and nursing staff. I knew now what I could tell the Harrises. Their boy, Johnny, could be happy here. He'd be very well looked after, and there'd be plenty to keep him occupied. He'd be amongst his equals, instead of being avoided or looked down upon by those more fortunate than himself. He'd be encouraged to work, useful, healthy work. His parents could come to see him as often as they wished. Once a year, he'd be able to spend his holidays with them. Yes, I thought I knew what I could tell the Harrises. But to my surprise, the medical superintendent didn't agree with me at all. Oh, he appreciated my concern for Mrs. Harris and my compliments on the running of his hospital. But he pointed out quite firmly that there were many cases far more serious, far more deserving of hospital attention than Johnny Harris. One was brought in, a stretcher case, as we stood there talking. The mental deficiency hospitals throughout the country are terribly overcrowded. There are some 60,000 hospital patients in England and Wales, the medical superintendent told me, and the waiting lists of urgent cases total several thousand more. The regional hospital boards are doing all they can, but it costs up to £3,000 a bed to build a complete hospital of this type. Even where new hospitals can be built, it's not easy to recruit sufficient staff of the right quality. It requires a very special kind of devotion to care for such unfortunates, so deficient of mind that they're incapable of doing even the smallest thing for themselves. Some, the very worst of cases, will have to be nursed through every minute of their lives. Many are crippled, epileptic, or suffer from some psychosis. To each and every one of us, however, life is sacred. Who can tell what wonders medical science might not be able to achieve within a lifetime? Drugs can already help a few, like this little girl who has destroyed everything ever put in her hands, who must be kept constantly under restraint. Others come from bad homes. Often their mental deficiency has resulted in gross behavior problems. Some have been sent here by the courts. No, the medical superintendent felt strongly that Johnny would be far better off staying where he was. Johnny came from a good home, he pointed out. His parents were responsible people and were genuinely fond of the boy. More than anything else, however, Johnny could feel at home that he was wanted. He too could contribute, if only a little. This feeling of belonging gives us all stability, whatever our mental level. Oh yes, I could see that from Johnny's own point of view, it might be wrong to pack him off to hospital away from home. But how about Mrs. Harris? Devoted though she was to her boy, how long could she go on being mother to a grown man with the mind of a child? Johnny was born a mental defective, but this was by no means obvious at the beginning. His parents had looked forward longingly to his coming and were overjoyed when presented with a son. How happy Mrs. Harris must have been in those early days, wheeling her baby up to the clinic. It's true he seemed a little slower than other babies in sitting up and walking. But it wasn't until he was 3 or 4 years old that the nature and extent of his backwardness became apparent. When it did, it came as a terrible shock to his parents, something beyond their understanding. The local health visitor reported the case to the medical officer of health and gave Mrs. Harris a lot of advice and assistance. It was she who had to tell Mrs. Harris that Johnny was unlikely ever to go to an ordinary school. Mrs. Harris took it hard at first, but she saw the sense of it later on. Johnny, at 7, was still incontinent, unable to concentrate, and spoke only with great difficulty. Since school was out of the question, even the local school for educationally subnormal children, Johnny went to an occupation centre run by the local health authority. Mrs. Harris would put him on a special bus every morning with other children and had the satisfaction of knowing that he was in safe hands throughout the day. All efforts to teach Johnny to read or write, or even to converse intelligibly, were in vain. But he got on quite well with the other children and continued to improve in social habits. Most local health authorities run such centres for mentally defective children. Children. They nearly always thought I was children, but many, particularly the girls, stay until they're quite adult. There's usually no fixed leaving age, but most boys seem to go, for one reason or another, between the ages of 17 and 20. Some become troublesome and have to be sent off to institutions. Nearly always their places are wanted for younger children. Some occupation centres are halls rented for the purpose during the day. Others, specially built, are better equipped. The National Association for Mental Health runs training courses for their staffs and for the teachers in the hospitals. Oh yes, the occupation centres do a very useful job. And as long as Johnny had been able to attend the centre each day, Mrs. Harris had been able to cope. But now, at the time they came to see me, Johnny had grown too big to mix with the younger children, and he was on his parents' hands all day. They continued to treat him as a child, so he remained as helpless as a child. And who could blame them? But Mr. Harris wondered how long his wife could stand it. Wondered, too, what Johnny's fate would be if anything should happen to his mother or himself. They felt they couldn't leave him in the house or let him wander out alone. Mentally defective youths are easy prey for delinquent gangs and are often left to take the blame for some criminal escapade. Girls are obviously in greater danger. So Johnny stayed at home. But not so Bill, a case I met a little later. He'd been born even more handicapped than Johnny Harris, but Bill had been trained to independence. Some local health authorities believe they've solved the problem of adult mental defectives. Now, this centre is not an occupation centre, but an industrial centre, where some 50 adult defectives get a thorough training in a definite job. Take Albert, for example. He's 25 and has a very low mental age, much below Johnny Harris. Every day, he occupies his time and all his mind chopping firewood, a job which keeps him happy and earns him money. Albert is the lowest grade in training at the industrial centre. They haven't found anything else yet that Albert can do. But chopping firewood he can do as well as anyone. And he hasn't even cut himself in 2 whole years. Tom, too, is happy in his job. A simple, mechanical, repetitive job, making concrete posts for use within the centre and for sale. He has an IQ of about 38. The other trainees are of a higher standard. They've come here from the local occupation centres, where they've learned social habits and how to play with others. Now an attempt is being made to do something useful with their lives, and to save them from admittance to an institution. That's the point. To save them having to be sent away from home. Operating this wire netting machine is not an end in itself. This is the therapy of discipline, a toughening of mind and body for more productive work to follow. The trainees are then given tasks especially suited to their particular abilities and are coached by trained and very patient teachers. If they respond, and most of them do respond in time, more and more tricky jobs are found for them to do, until they're making articles of furniture and other things to sell. Firms are encouraged by the local health authority to contract to the centre jobs that their employees would find irksome or unprofitable. When someone reaches this stage, soldering leads for TV sets, for example, he has really become productive, bringing in money from outside. This industrial centre is only a beginning. It wasn't easy to find a site, or the money for the buildings, the equipment and the instructors. Training at first was largely trial and error. Neville, for example, needed a lot of firm handling before he could make a Christmas cracker. Apart from his natural frailty and deficiency of mind, he had an aversion to noise. But after a while, he mastered it. The centre has flourished too, and you'll be interested to hear, at no huge burden on the rates. In fact, the income from the men's earnings has justified the building of a new industrial centre for women. The Oldham experiment is attracting a good deal of attention and praise. Neville will one day get a similar job in a factory nearby. Tom certainly will never be able to find a job outside the industrial centre. But Bill, the mill hand, and 7 or 8 others have already graduated out, having been hardened to face life and trained to do a job, to earn a wage. Neville is still under training, but already he's much more independent. He gets himself to and from the industrial centre by bus, something he's never done before alone. Neville still lives at home with his mother and his 2 younger sisters. Both perfectly normal children, you'll notice, and very fond of their brother. Bill, too, lives at home. But even should his parents die, he'd still be able to make a go of it alone. The local authority would help him find a room. One day they hope to have a hostel for adult mental defectives who've been trained to stand on their own feet. Mental deficiency can't be cured. Bill can't be trained beyond his mental ability. But the Oldham experiment has shown that it is possible to give these hands some skill, the afflicted mind some measure of independence. But what about poor Johnny Harris, still utterly dependent upon his mother? Where he lives, there doesn't happen to be an industrial centre or anything similar for defectives of his age. Without his parents, he'd be lost. I was glad the Harrises had come to see me. They'd given me a new respect for people, but there was nothing I could do to help them, not on my own. His mother's health grew worse, and in the end, I had to insist that Johnny go away. What else was there to do? But I'm convinced that it was wrong. And there must be many more like Johnny Harris, cut off from the world in hospitals where beds are badly needed. Surely something better can be done.